Hello everybody, this is Peter Svidler with the recap video of Game 5 of the World Championship match going on in London between Fabiano Caruana and the world champion Magnus Carlsen. I don't know why I did it in that order. And Game 5 was not a very long game, which has surprisingly happened a number of times already in this match. Normally you associate games played by Magnus with extreme length, but not this time around. But a game featuring a number of very interesting turns and a very peculiar looking endgame, which I struggled to understand during the live show, and frankly don't entirely understand even now, having clicked around in it for a little bit with a powerful engine. But I will try to explain what happened in the game. So let's get started. Once again, Fabiano opened with 1e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. This continues to be the main topic of discussion in Fabiano's white games in this match. g6, and here for the first time in the match, instead of bishop takes c6, which was seen in games 1 and 3, Fabiano played rook castles here, bishop g7 and rook e1. And there's obviously already a number of possibilities here for black. There's a lot of theory connected with the move knight f6, followed by e5, knight d5 for instance, and knight c3. Or alternatively, you can play c3 here, castles d4, and there's a lot of theory here connected with the move d5 for instance. So a great scope for theoretical discussion. But Magnus, instead of all that, makes the move e7 v5, which is also obviously a very serious and a very topical reply to what white is doing. And Fabiano opted for a very sharp line in reply to e5, which is b2 b4. And it's not a novelty. This idea has been tried in this and similar positions by a great number of people. For instance, after bishop takes e6, and arguably b takes e6 is maybe not entirely precise here anyway, but in this position b2 b4 was played by none other than Bobby Fischer in his return match against Boris Spassky in 1992 on Sveti Stefan. And 6b4 without capturing on c6 has been played by a number of strong players, including Etienne Bacrot in Paris in 2017 against our co-commentator Alexander Grishuk, and for instance by Richard Rapport against Julio Grande Zuniga in 2013. So an interesting move, but it seems like it doesn't refute the line, which is maybe not entirely surprising because the line is quite solid and black hasn't really done very much to deserve to be much worse. And Alexander Grishuk, who perhaps was somewhat surprised by this choice, chose to take with the pawn and just play a3 b3 in this position, returning the pawn and finishing development. And he was soon doing perfectly well in that game against Etienne Bacrot. But knight takes b4 is clearly the main move here, and this is what Magnus decides to do. And Fabi instantly replies with bishop b2. And here an interesting thing happens, starting from this move in particular. Magnus took some time, at least some time, on almost every single one of his decisions leading up to maybe move 13. And a theory put forward by Alexander Grishuk, who is very perceptive about these things, was that this perhaps prompted Fabiano to take unnecessary risks later in the game, because maybe it gave him the illusion that Magnus doesn't know exactly what's going on here and is maybe actually on his own and has to figure all of these things over the board. And that prompted Fabiano to go for a line which is slightly riskier. But first things first. The game between Richard Rapport and Julio Grande Zuniga, I brought this up specifically because Julio, being an absolutely fearless and an absolutely, very, very principled player who doesn't shirk from all kinds of complications, he played Queen c7 here, a move we mentioned during the live broadcast. White replies to this by playing c3, knight c6, and d4. And in this position, Julio went for a very peculiar line. He played d6, d5, a6. Obviously, black doesn't lose the piece to the pin along this diagonal because he can attack the bishop. And now white goes knight a3, with the point that if black takes, this knight puts additional pressure on the d6 pawn. White is also threatening to take the knight. It's almost winning for him. But after knight a3, Julio played king e7. And now once again, if white takes, black takes, knight takes b5, and the king himself successfully participates in the defense of the pawn on d6, which is why Richard just played bishop f1 back. And a very curious position arose on the board after move 14, where black has an extra pawn, but also his king is on e7 and his pieces are slightly weird looking. But he has a very solid pawn structure, and it's not that easy at all for white to prove that he has enough compensation here. And as a matter of fact, Richard Rapport ended up losing this game with white. But Magnus, instead of that, played a6, which is a more conservative option and a very obvious one. You want to drive the bishop away from the b5 square before you return with a knight to c6, so that obviously if you return now, white can just win this pawn back by playing knight takes e5, and he's doing quite well. But after a6, white has this move a3, which clarifies the situation with the knight. Once again, if you go knight c6, white can just collect the pawn on e5, and therefore black takes on b5, takes on a1, bishop a1, and goes d7, d6. In a very old game played in 2003, my old friend Luki Van Veli took on b4 in this position and did not manage to prove that this type of pawn structure is particularly good for black, and lost to a player much lower rated than himself, which I think is enough proof that this is something that you shouldn't be doing here. But d6, at first we were somewhat skeptical about this with Sopiko during the live show, because it seemed to me that, to us, that the weaknesses on the b file will be quite important, and white should have some option to exploit them straight away. But actual evaluation of this position is probably sort of complete equality. And my guess is Magnus knew that. But the fact that he got to this position, maybe having already spent 20 to 25 minutes, may have prompted Fabiano to go for a line which objectively is strategically quite seriously risky for white and required some precision from him. Although, once again, if you analyze it with the computer keeps on finding equality for white. But I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. If you don't want to risk anything at all here, you can take on d6, queen d6, and go d2, d4. And after, let's say, e d4, bishop takes d4, castles, takes, king takes g7, the game is very likely going to be just drawn after knight d4, let's say b4, and white just goes c3. And I mean, nobody is going to be beating anybody in this position. It's just quite clearly a very, very equal position. But Fabi chose to play queen e2, which was also a move that attracted my attention immediately, because it looks like black is severely overextending. B4 is the only move not to sort of resign on the spot. But once again, it turns out that black is just reasonably well in control if you analyze this position. And I will repeat this. The feeling I have is that Magnus actually knew all that, and he was sort of tempting Fabi into indiscretions here. Of course, white probably can still bail out here if he wants into some equal positions. One of them, for instance, arises after queen b5 check, knight c6, and here white can play either cd6, queen d6, d3, castles, knight bd2, and here, for instance, the computer suggests that black has to play queen c7, knight c4, and bishop e6, which is already not very obvious, with the idea of giving up the e5 pawn and creating a lot of counterplay along the a file, and this apparently is some kind of equality. Or white, after queen b5, knight c6, can try the immediate d4, e d4. Knight takes d4 castles is not very good, because after knight c6, bc6, both the queen and the bishop will be hanging, so white should take with the bishop, black castles, you take on g7. And here white can play something like h2, h3, for instance, with equality, because after rook d1, black develops a surprising amount of counterplay by playing bishop g4, cd6, takes, and queen f6. And the passer on the d file is not as important as the fact that white ruined his kingside structure and the knight is still very stupid on b1. Of course, white still has equality, but FIDE was playing for more. FIDE played queen c4. The difference being, of course, that after knight c6, d4, e4, and knight takes d4, black can no longer really castle because white, in this position, the queen is not on b5, it's not c4, therefore it's not hanging. So white just takes on g7, takes on b4, and is close to winning because it has a healthy extra pawn. But even here, the computer in this position suggests that black can take on d4 with the bishop, play bishop e6 with the tempo, queen b5 castles, bishop e3, takes, and rook e8. And once again, the stupidity of this knight on b1 actually compensates for potential sacrifices. White can take on b4, white can take on b7. But the machine is completely unafraid in both of those cases and suggests that black, with reasonably accurate play, holds in both of those variations. But Magnus wasn't having any of it, and quite quickly I think you can sort of claim that this is where the trap, the jaws of the trap snapped shut on Fabiano. Magnus played queen a5 quite quickly, c takes d6 and bishop e6, and black is not better, not by any stretch, but in particular, if white sort of continues to play for a win sharply here, he can actually run into trouble, and you will see it later on. You are more or less obliged to play queen c7 here, because if you play queen e1, black can, for instance, go knight c8, the bishop is still hanging, you have to waste a tempo playing bishop b2, and black castles, and we'll pick up on d6 next move with a very, very comfortable position. Probably not better, but I mean, definitely not worse. And queen d3 is even worse, because after knight c6, bishop b2, there is this move queen a2, which actually picks up one of the light pieces on the queen side, because white is just very, very short on squares here. Queen c7 therefore has been played in the game, takes, knight c6, and here was arguably the last time where white could go for a variation where he never will risk anything at all. White could have played, instead of the move c3 that Fabiano chose, white could have played rook d1, and here probably king d7 is the more precise option. There's also king e7, d4, rook a8, d5, rook takes a1, g takes e6, rook a8, ef, and rook c8. And the machine suggests white is ever so slightly better here, but I suspect in practical play this is very close to complete equality. And after king d7, d4, black also has two ways of making a draw. Now black can play bishop g4 here, and after the more or less forced d5, knight d4, knight bd2, takes, and king takes c7, the machine holds this position quite comfortably for black without too much hassle. And there is also a very beautiful move after d2, d4. Black can play b4, b3 here, attacking the pawn on c2, and thus negating the threat of d4, d5. And here, for instance, after knight takes c5, black takes another tempo to play king takes c7. And this is an incredibly, there's an incredibly strange, completely equal according to the machine position that I wanted to show you. White takes on b3, black makes another tempo move, rook a8. And here there are two equalities. One is normal, which is the line knight c3, black takes on b3, white has knight d5 check, you go king d6. I mean, I say normal, this is still kind of computerish, but compared to the other one, this is nothing. Knight takes f7, king e6, knight g5, king d6, and finally white has a choice of just giving this perpetual or allowing black to win the central pawns one after the other. And we end up in some position like this, which of course black will hold. But apart from knight c3, there is this move knight d2 here, to which the computer replies by taking on e5 with the bishop, going d5, and just playing rook a2, let's say h4, and h5. And black has no threats, or at least currently has no threats. And white is 2 pawns up, and both of them are reasonably healthy in the center. And the machine doesn't give white even a smidgen of advantage here because of how completely tied up his pieces are here. Black wants to play b5, further restricting what white is doing with the knight on d2, not even allowing knight c4. If white plays knight c4 immediately, black will play b5 and drive with two other squares, and the pawn on b3 will start hanging. And also importantly, if white goes bishop c3, it gets attacked from c2 and has really no other squares apart from just going back to a1. So the machine says completely equal in this position, which is a bit curious. I mean, you don't see positions like this, like it's an endgame with three pieces on the board, and one side is 2 pawns up. And there are no threats and no passers for the weaker side, and the weaker side is still not really weaker. Curious position, I thought, which I wanted to show you for those reasons. So rook d1, arguably white is the side pressing here, but black will survive if he plays sensibly. But FIDE chose to play c3 instead, and Magnus made what probably is the only move in this position. But once he made it, he was definitely the one playing for a win. King d7, because giving white tempi to develop the knight all the way to d5 is just senseless. So king d7, c takes b4, and rook e8. And at this moment, Fabiano started thinking very, very deeply. And it became clear that he is obviously not very happy with his position, because you generally play quickly when you like your position, because you settle on something that you like reasonably fast. And secondly, it appeared that Magnus actually arguably out-prepared Fabiano, because I have a feeling the speed with which he made all these moves suggests that he had this somewhere on file, and he was taking the time as a kind of a combination of perhaps tricking Fabiano into thinking he doesn't know anything, and also checking that he doesn't forget anything, which is a very important part of today's chess. And despite currently white being 2 pawns up, it is definitely white who needs to be careful here. Bishop c3 is the best move in the position, and really the most obvious move. You really don't want to be giving up the pawn on b4. King takes c7. And here the move that Fabiano made arguably leads to him having a slightly worse position. But black has to be very, very precise in reply. And the move that the computer suggests is stronger is knight g5, which is something that we were arguing for during the live show. Not only attacking the bishop on e6, but also creating the idea of f2, f4, which is very relevant because white badly needs at least some counterplay. And you can see this, for instance, in the line bishop a2. And here, I mean, I guess you can start with f4, but the point is you can take on h7 and play f4 after f6. And black can pick this knight up, but then white develops this huge, massive pawn center, and white has currently 4 pawns for the piece, not even 3. And this position, once again, as usual these days, the computer just says it's equal, but it gets sharp, and white has his own chances, of course, despite being a piece down. And another important resource you have to probably see if you play knight g5 is that after rook a4, white takes on e6. And here a very important maneuver, rook e3, intending rook f3 and getting the rook to f7, suddenly gives white a decent amount of immediate counterplay on the king side. And it's very, very relevant for white to create as much counterplay on the king side as possible, as early as possible. And returning to bishop f8, which was also something we were arguing for during the live show, here the computer suggests that white needs to take, play b5, and after knight d4, king f1, according to the computer, is the only precise move which makes sure that white is not worse. And frankly, it's not surprising that Fabiano chose not to go for positions like this, because they look kind of scary. If black manages to comfortably pick up the b-pawn without abandoning anything in the center, he will be, I guess the range is better to winning. And you can't blame Fabi for, let's say, not trusting that he will not be much worse in some position like this. But the machine once again suggests that there is no real reason to fear here for white, and white is just fine. But instead of all this, Fabi played d3, And here it was Magnus's turn to take a very, very long time to settle on a move. And the move he chose is, I mean, I think it's fair to call it at least an inaccuracy and maybe even go harsher and say it's a mistake, because I think he probably missed Fabiano's reply. And after that reply, Black is really not playing for a win anymore. There's any number of very comfortable draws for White, and maybe even, well, not more, but very comfortable draws. And the options we were seriously considering here during the live show, I think we eventually settled on either king b6, which is what Magnus chose, or the move b5. And b5 looks very, very nice aesthetically, because you fix the pawn on b4, and you will eventually prepare and try to pick it up. Let's say you prepare and play bishop f8, or you just play rook a4 later. And also it gives you a very comfortable square on b6 for the king for the future. But of course, king b6 has obvious justifications as well. You want to just play king b5 and pick this pawn up. And activating your king makes plenty of sense in general in any endgame. And it's just because there is a very direct refutation, basically, of the move king b6 that b5 is stronger. But even after b5, I left the machine running for a while here, and the machine, with precise play, holds this position after both knight bd2, and also even after king f1, although after king f1 the position kind of gets scary. And here, once again, the machine is just so much more precise against compared to human play, because I would automatically play king b6 here. But apparently it's very important that in some variations later, much later in the game, after d4, e4, and knight takes d4, if you take with the knight on d4, this is a check. And because of all that, the machine actually quite actively prefers king b7 to king b6. But even here, after knight bd2, rook a3, and rook c1, it's almost impossible to convince it black is better, because generally, eventually, to free up the bishop on g7 from the defense of the pawn on e5, you will have to play f6. For instance, bishop h6, king e2, and f6. And here, bishop f8 is a huge, big threat. But White is just in time to play d4, e4, bishop takes d4, and he should hold here. Black is never worse in these positions, but White should generally hold without too much trouble. And another move we quite liked, I mean, not really liked, but we discussed it quite heavily during the live broadcast, was knight bd2. And here we eventually came to the conclusion that rook d8 gives black a serious advantage, kind of missing the fact that after rook c1, White threatens bishop takes e5, king b6. We thought that this actually wins the pawn on d3 and completely ignored the fact that White has knight e1. And this looks extremely ugly, but ugly or not, White is still a pawn up. And after, let's say, bishop f8, rook b1, the machine holds this position, even though it looks very, very scary. But let's say after the naive rook a8, White goes knight df3, attacks the pawn on e5, and also he's preparing d3, d4 as usual. And if black plays g6, g5, which is a very smart move, preparing basically to be able to chase the knight away from f3 by playing g4 at a good moment. But here White can play rook b2, because it's very important for you to have after rook a8 the option of playing knight c2 without allowing rook a2. And once again, in a practical game, finding a move like rook b1, b2 might not be so easy, because I think you will be very, very tempted to just play king f1. But then after rook a8 you are already in trouble, because the rook might penetrate via a2 and you will not be able to set up your ideal defensive construction. But after rook b2, let's say rook a8, knight c2, or rook a8, knight c2 is actually a possible immediate draw with this repetition. Or black can flex a little bit more on the king side by playing, let's say, g4, f3, and h5. But White plays king f2, and yes, his breathing space is extremely limited in a position like this. But there's only one real weakness now that the pawn on d3 is adequately covered, and it is possible, I think, for White to hold on to the pawn on b4 for grim life, and he will not lose. But I think objectively, had Magnus played b5 here, FIDE would have been required to make a number of very precise decisions to hold on, and it is very possible to slip into very unpleasant positions here with white. But after king b6, FIDE did find the best option here. That was during the live show suggested by Alexander Grishuk. I did not see it, and I have a feeling that Magnus either didn't see it or really didn't appreciate how strong it was. Bishop c3, g2. I think it's very easy because the knight on b1 is the problem, and you kind of expect white to be able to be developing the knight to that square. But then after king b5, black is quite significantly better. But bishop d2, creating an idea of bishop b3 check, and more importantly, creating the idea of developing the knight to c3, is just incredibly strong here. And here Magnus actually did the correct thing, because we were arguing in the studio for playing bishop f8 here, with still potential advantage for black, when in actual fact black barely holds on here after bishop b3 check, king b5, knight c3 check, king takes b4, and I believe we were going knight d5 check here during the live show, but bishop d2 is much stronger. And for instance, after king c5, rook b1, already there is no direct equality for black. Black probably shouldn't lose this, but it's clearly better for white already. And after king b3, rook b1 check, king c2, there are some very nice variations. White goes rook c1 check, and the only move that doesn't lose here apparently is king b2. It's very important to go to this precise square, because I think the idea is that after king b3 and knight e1, rook b1 is just a tremendously strong threat. Whereas after king b2 and knight e1, black will have the option of playing rook a1 and making a draw. But the more beautiful lines arise after king takes d3, where white goes knight e1 check. If you take on d2, you actually get mated all the way on e1. And if you go king d4 here, I think you lose to bishop e3 and knight d5 check, and you run out of squares, if I remember correctly. And after king c4, white goes knight d5 check, king d4, knight f6, once again completely locking down the king in the center of the board, rook a3, bishop e3 check, rook takes, knight c2 check, and black will have to work very, very hard not to lose this position. So all in all, bishop f8 would have been a very ill-judged decision by Magnus, because he would have to work quite hard not to lose this. Instead, he played rook d8. And here, FIDE also took a practical decision, because he could have played knight c3 here, black takes on d3, you go knight a4, king b5, knight c5. And white is not worse, but also in some position like rook a3, knight b7, and bishop f8, maybe black can pretend for a little bit, because knight is somewhat misplaced. It is clearly a draw with best play, but maybe it gives white, it gives black, some options of continuing for a while. Maybe white can misplay this somehow. And the move he chose instead, which is bishop e3 check, just makes a more or less forced draw on the spot. And it also has to be mentioned a curious idea that after bishop d2, if you leave the computer running long enough, the computer actually suggests playing king c7 and says this might be the best move in the position. But having just played king b6, I don't think there's anyone in the world who can actually play king c7 in this position. It's just so completely inhuman. So back to the position after bishop d2, rook d8, bishop e3 check is what Fabiano chose instead of knight c3. King goes forward, knight c3 check, forward, knight d5 check, takes, rook b1 check. And here the machine actually suggests that, you might want to do this just to make an immediate draw, because if white goes knight g5, black can play f5, and yes, the h7 pawn gets lost, but it gets traded for the pawn on d3, so black really runs no risks. But what Magnus did is also a draw. King c3 takes, knight d8, rook c7 check, king takes d3, king f1. And here we were able to predict exactly what Magnus will do, because despite the fact that black is a pawn up, his light pieces are so completely misplaced, and actually even his king is in such relative trouble that it was very understandable that Magnus bailed out more or less straight away. one funny position here is e4 91 mate on the board to the king on d3. But also you have to say that if black makes some kind of an indifferent move like h6 and white plays g4, this is already quite tricky for black, because the threat now is, once again, after some stupid move, white already is threatening to win a full exchange. And if you go king e4, king e2, the king really is somewhat stuck in the center, and it becomes slightly awkward for black to play from here, maybe even more than slightly. Which is why Magnus included h5 and h3, re-establishing the idea of g4, and just immediately returned the f7 pawn, but brought his king back to safety. White won the pawn back, bishop f6. This is why you needed to include h5 and h3, because otherwise white could have taken on h7, and that would have been an unpleasant endgame, but now there's no pawn on h7. And Fabiano played g4 check and offered a draw, because obviously the position is just completely equal here with 3 against 3 on one side. So this is game 5, yet another game that ended in a draw. So the situation in the match remains unchanged, 2.5 against 2.5. But in an interesting, slight plot twist, the regulations for World Championship matches stipulate that midway through the match there is a change of the order of colors for the 2 games they play until the rest day. What I mean to say is that for the first 6 games, Fabiano starts with white and then plays with black, and then there's a rest day. And from game 7 onwards, they will play, Magnus will start with white, then a black game, and then a rest day, which means that both game 6 and game 7 will feature Magnus having the white pieces. And so far he was frankly underwhelming with the white pieces in this match, not really posing Fabiano and Team Fabiano any serious problems whatsoever. But 2 whites in a row with a rest day between them is, I think, a very good time for Magnus to try something and finally maybe get somewhere with the white pieces. We'll see what happens. I hope you join us for the live show tomorrow for game 6. But for now, thanks for watching. This has been Peter Svidler with the highlight video of the 5th round of the World Championship match in London. Cheers, everyone.